So we are going to begin this first session, which is the calls for deaconesses and the women's ministry in the church. And we talked about that a little bit last night in Dr. Frederick Frost's keynote. Miss Sara Tsugranis is going to be our moderator, and we will have panelists Dr. Teva Regule, Miss Sophia Kyrou, and Dr. Ioana Popa, who offered the reflection. All of their bios are in your program, so I will now turn it over to Sara.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. You'll go to them.
Could you turn the sound up, please?
Good morning. Is that okay? Good morning. My name is Sara Tsugranis, and I'll be moderating our first panel for today. Calls for Deaconesses and Women's Ministry in the Church is not a new topic of discussion in the life of the Orthodox Church. This session will present the numerous calls to do so from the modern period. It will also highlight the many ways that lay women are currently serving in diaconal-type capacities. While acknowledging that these ministries are important in and of themselves, this session will further explain why ordination is valuable and necessary to participate more fully in the diaconal ministry of the church. Please let me briefly introduce our panelists for this first session. Dr. Teva Regule teaches at Boston College, is the current president of the Orthodox Theological Society in America, and she serves on the St. Phoebe Center board. Ms. Sophia Kyrou is a graduate of Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and is a tonsured Byzantine chanter. Dr. Ioana Popa is a Christian spiritual formation life coach and trainer and founder of Team for the Soul. They have a table below for our symposium. For longer bios, please see the printed program.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you to Sara for the introduction. I wanted to bring to your attention briefly some of the information in your packet. So if you could get your packet out. There is a beautiful article that we wrote, Towards the Reasoned and Respectful Conversation for Deaconesses. This is a short synopsis of the issues at hand, the question for today, and some of which we'll be referring to today. The next page is a myth-busting session, which we will actually talk about in our next session, so just succinctly placed here. And we also have an afternoon discussion on this as well. But the two pieces that I'd like you to get out from my presentation follow, and they are the calls for revival of the ordained ministry, the calls document here, and the major conferences that have explored this issue. So I will be referring to these documents as I speak, and if you wanted to follow along, then you'll get it. Anyway, use your sheets to follow along. There's other wonderful information in your packet. We have a short synopsis that we were able to translate from Metropolitan Seraphim from Zimbabwe. We translated his work from the Greek, as well as a short description of the African Women's Grant project that we've initiated. So please take the time to look through those, and for this presentation today to look particularly at the call session and the conferences. So I've entitled my talk, Diaconal Ministry and the Calls to Revive the Female Diaconate. Women have always participated in the diaconal ministry of the church. In the early church, they participated in both ordained and unordained capacities. In an ordained capacity, the deaconess ministered to women, much as the male deacon ministered to men. She assisted with baptism, took the Eucharist to those unable to attend liturgy, mediated between the faithful and the clergy, and taught and counseled and guided the faithful in their Christian journey, especially those new to the faith. Women continue to serve in many of these same ways as chaplains, spiritual directors, chanters, readers, homilists, philanthropic outreach coordinators, and parish administrators. In addition, they are often missionaries and Christian educators, to just name a few of the many diaconal ministries in which they are actively participating. However, today they do so without an ordination. So in our work, we are sometimes asked, well, then why then do women have to be ordained to do diaconal work? Now, first of all, I want to emphasize that the work of the laity is important, and we should not minimize it. But still, we are a church that ordains people. And this presentation will focus on how we understand our ordained ministries, our ordained orders, and in particular, how the diaconate fits into the threefold ministry of Christ. I will then highlight the numerous calls for the revival of the female diaconate in the Orthodox Church and the need for the ministry today. So let me begin with the fundamental assertion that there is only one ministry in the church, and that is Christ's ministry. We are all, clergy and laity alike, called to participate in this ministry. In fact, we are all ordained, if you will, into the ministry of Christ, the royal priesthood, at our baptism and chrismation. It is here that we are anointed as priest, prophet, and king, participating in the life of the priest, prophet, and king. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries within this royal priesthood, a threefold pattern of bishop, presbyter, and deacon emerges as the formal pattern of ordained ministry in the church. So what does it mean to be ordained? Although there is little reflection on this question, per se, in the first millennium of Christianity, there are, in fact, treatises and various ministries. For instance, we have St. John Chrysostom's advice to the Episcopal candidates in a little booklet called On the Priesthood, as well as early church documents, for instance, the Apostolic Constitutions, and the canons that regulate age, marital status, and other attributes of the canon, or rather of the candidates. But none, to my knowledge, speak specifically to what an ordination really means. It is a setting apart for people for a particular community, and having been recognized by that community, their gifts were enlivened by the grace of the Holy Spirit. They were elevated to priesthood, in other words, bishop, presbyter, or deacon, and what we sometimes call the major orders. They were ordained in the context of the Eucharist, at the altar, and by the bishop. The Eucharist was the foundation of ordination. Their service was tied to the liturgy and the altar as the source and summit of their ministry. The deacon, in particular, connected the liturgy of our lives to the sacramental life of the church. In practical terms, ordination sets up a reciprocal relationship between the church and the ordained. The ordained carry the authority to serve and the credibility to do so, as well as the support of the church, but then they are also held accountable to her. One cannot just say anything or give one's own opinion on matters. The ordained are representatives of the church. In other words, there are no loose cannons. Ordination requires obedience to the church through her bishops. In addition, the ordained are also trained and vetted for ministry, and oftentimes in ways that the laity are not. So how are these three expressions of priesthood, bishop, presbyter, and deacon, understood, and how do they relate to one another? According to the understanding of the church, the bishop, or the episkopos, is the overseer of the community. He is, quote unquote, at the center of the visible unity of the church and the spokesman for traditional doctrine. And here I'm quoting Deacon John Chrysostomos. The priest or presbyter serves the local community. He is the minister of the word and sacrament, and it is through his hands that we offer our sacrifice of praise to God, and from whose hands that we encounter the peace of Christ in the liturgy. The deacons exemplify the interdependence of worship and service in the church's life. Historically, the diaconate has been a ministry that has focused on service and has included pastoral care for the faithful, philanthropic outreach, reading of the scriptures, and sometimes preaching, and other forms of liturgical service, for instance, preparing the offerings of the people, leading the petitions for the concerns of the people, taking communion to the sick, etc., as well as ecclesiastical administration. And in particular, it is grounded in the way that the church meets the world. For over 1,000 years, the Orthodox Church ordained women to higher orders, and in particular to serve as deaconesses. In the 1954 landmark study by Evangelos Theodorou in Greek, and he wrote in Greek, and I apologize for my Greek, η χειροτονία, η χειροθεσία των diaconosin, the ordination or the appointment of deaconesses, showed that her ordination took place during the Eucharist and Divine Liturgy, not before the service, as in the minor orders, at the same place in the service as the male deacon was ordained. It included 2 prayers, as for a major order, instead of 1, which would be the case if it was just considered to be a minor order, one of which calls down God's divine grace, which was unique to the major orders. She was ordained at the altar by the bishop, received the orarion, the stole, and then later in the service received Holy Communion at the altar with the other clergy. All of these are marks of a higher order of clergy. So the modern renewal and the calls to renew the office. In modern times, I think the entire diaconate has experienced a renewal and rejuvenation. According to a report from the Oriental Orthodox Roman Catholic consultation held at St. Nerses Seminary back in 2003, Father Simeon Abadassian of the Armenian Church stated that, and I quote, "The ancient societal roles, or rather the ancient social roles of the deacons, is being revived in the Armenian tradition," unquote. In addition to the central role they play in the liturgical services of the Armenian Church, their duties include training altar servers, and it should be noted that some Armenian churches now allow girls to serve in this capacity, visiting the sick, and taking on responsibilities of parish administration. The ordination of the female deacon is also part of the history of the Armenian Church and is also being revived. According to the report from the Discerning of the Times Conference for Women held in Istanbul in 1997, His Beatitude Patriarch Karakin II mentioned that the Armenian Apostolic Church had, quote, taken the initiative in ordaining women to the order of diaconate, an order in which both men and women are ordained and perform similar duties, unquote. At the same meeting, it was reported by Archbishop Mesrab Metafian, the patriarchal vicar for ecumenical relations, spoke of the traditional practice of the Armenian Church to ordain women to the diaconate. And the consultation report goes on to say, and here I quote, "There is no difference between the ordination service for women and men. Women deacons take care of orphans, assist women in baptism, serve liturgically at the altar, read the gospel, and bring the host to the priest. At this time, women deacons come from the monastic tradition," unquote. However, it should be noted that the Armenian Church ordained a non-monastic woman in Iran in 2017 with the understanding that she could get married in the future if she so desired, which is the custom of the Armenian Church. In the Armenian Church, you don't have to be married prior to the diaconate, so you're allowed to marry afterwards. In the Byzantine East, especially in the United States, the male diaconate is growing as well. Training programs have been established to train candidates, and in some places, male deacons are assuming more responsibility for the pastoral care and the philanthropic work of the community. However, in other places, the ministry is still exercised either as an interim step prior to the ordination to the presbyterate, or solely as a liturgical functionary, and the female diaconate has not as yet been revived. And here I refer you to our call sheet. There have been numerous attempts for over 100 years to reinstate the female diaconate in the Orthodox Church. As early as 1855, the sister of Tsar Nicholas tried to restore the office, and other prominent Russians also lobbied for its restoration, including Alexander Gumanovsky and Mother Catherine, or the Countess Evamovsky. According to numerous sources, in 1905-1906, several bishops, archbishops, and metropolitans of the Russian Orthodox Church encouraged this effort. And according to the report on the consultation of Orthodox women in Agapia in 1976, this issue was to be a major topic at the Council of the Russian Church beginning in 1917. But due to the political turmoil in Russia at the time, the Council's work was not addressed. Other efforts were made in Greece. On Pentecost Sunday in 1911, Archbishop, now Saint Nectarios, ordained a nun to the diaconate to serve the ministerial needs of her community, and in particular to serve the liturgy by reading the gospel, saying the petitions, and distributing communion. In 1953, Archbishop Michael, what was then called the Greek Orthodox Church of North and South America, called for the reestablishment of the order to help meet the ministerial needs of the fledgling Greek Orthodox Church in this country. And I quote, "There is so much that needs to be done in each community that the endeavors of these priests alone do not suffice. For should a priest wish to know, as he must his spiritual children by name, their problems and their spiritual and moral needs, this would certainly be beyond his physical and spiritual resources. These tremendous needs of our Greek Orthodox Church in America have urged us to make a fervent appeal such as this to our daughters in Christ. With the future welfare of the Church and the membership at heart, we are considering the establishment in this country of an order of deaconess," unquote. In the 1960s, his successor, Archbishop Iakovos of blessed memory, expressed the same desire in 2 keynote addresses to the clergy laity congresses of the Greek Archdiocese. More recently, the issue has been discussed at a number of international conferences. The first of these was held primarily for Orthodox women in Agapia, Romania in 1976, where the restoration of the female diaconate was unanimously recommended. This was followed by a meeting in Sofia, Bulgaria in 1987 that continued to urge serious consideration to the issue. Then in 1988, the most substantive gathering to discuss, quote unquote, the ordination of women was held in Rhodes, Greece. This conference was called by the ecumenical patriarch Demetrius I as part of the preconciliar work of what was then to have been the Great and Holy Council of the Orthodox Church at the time, the council that was not held until 2016 in Crete. It was attended by approximately 70 people and official church delegates, including many bishops and priests, and expert advisors from the Eastern Orthodox churches from all over the world, with the exceptions of the Patriarch of Antioch and Jerusalem. It was originally organized in response to the challenge posed by the Orthodox churches by our ecumenical partners who had begun ordaining women to ministry and strove to articulate an orthodox understanding to this question. And while the consultation was not in favor of ordaining women to the presbyterate or the episcopacy, it did state that, quote, the order of deaconess should be revived, unquote. The consultation concluded that there was ample evidence for this ministry from apostolic times well into the Byzantine period, and that deaconesses were ordained, the technical term hierotonia, to higher orders, and that such a revival would, quote, represent a positive response to the many needs and demands of the contemporary world, unquote. Furthermore, the report suggested the possibility of opening up the so-called lower orders to women, for instance, the subdiaconate, tonsured readers, and altar servers, cantors, etc. The consultation at Rhodes was a pivotal event. It represents the first international Orthodox consensus on the revival of the female diaconate in the modern period, and it is from this consensus, upon all subsequent moves and additional conferences examining the issue have been based. So we have this consensus, at least on paper, let's say, of the Orthodox Church in the world. The question is, how are we to move forward? As Dr. Frost mentioned last night, many people thought the church would immediately move in this direction. And I remember that in the OCA, there was serious talk of doing so. Anecdotal evidence suggests that the reception among the laity was positive. In 1990, Matushka Ellen Gavostev of the OCA conducted a small survey among the laity to qualify this reception. Among her respondents were men and women of various ages and ethnic backgrounds, as well as both cradle Orthodox and those who joined the faith later in life. Notably, they all saw the need for the revival of the female diaconate, especially for pastoral care and spiritual guidance of the faithful. However, the OCA was concerned that such a move would set back their hoped-for recognition from Constantinople as an autocephalous church, so no move was made. In Russia at the time, women were already acting as de facto deacons. They assisted the priest in liturgy and provided pastoral care to the people. However, once communism fell and it became fashionable to attend church again, they were essentially ignored by the many, often young, men flooding into the church ready to reclaim their positions in it. What could have been an opportunity for formal recognition of their service was not the order of the day in the midst of the fervor of the time. Another international consultation was held in 1990 in Crete. Here, the participants emphasized the need for a fully functioning diaconate of both men and women. Furthermore, it fleshed out the ways that such a ministry could benefit the church. According to the consultation report, the delegates emphasized, and I quote, "There is an urgent need for a revival of women's ministries, particularly the diaconate. The presence of the deacon or deaconess could lead the people in prayer, give spiritual counsel, help to distribute communion where possible. The renewal of the diaconate for both men and women could meet the many needs of the world and of the church. The catechetical work, the pastoral relations, the serving the same needs for monastic communities without a presbyter, reading prayers for special occasions, performing social work, pastoral care, engaging youth and college ministry, counseling, anointing the infirm, carrying out missionary work, ministering to the sick, assisting the bishop or presbyter in the liturgical services." And it concludes, "A creative restoration of the diaconate for women, we hope, will lead in turn to the renewal of the diaconate for men," unquote. Since that time, additional conferences have been held in Damascus, Syria in 1996 and Istanbul in 1997, in which this issue has been both discussed and affirmed. The delegates to the Istanbul meeting in particular emphasized, quote, "The incorporation of deaconesses in the life of the church would help to contribute to the atmosphere of love and learning in the church," unquote. They stated further, quote, "Deaconesses are able to work as helpers to the priest and counselors to the people, providing an important link and thereby strengthening the relationships within the body of the church." Furthermore, in July of 2000, after a year of careful review on the subject, a formal letter was sent to the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew by more than a dozen members of the Orthodox community in Paris, including such noted Orthodox theologians as Elizabeth Berchigel, Father Boris Bourbonskoy, Olivier Clement, and Nicholas Slosky. The letter traces the history of the female diaconate and notes that the Patriarch himself has stated that, quote, "There is no obstacle in canon law," and the Patriarch Bartholomew was a canonist, he had studied canon law in Rome, "that states in the way that the ordination of women to the diaconate. This institution of the early church deserves to be revitalized," unquote. It also states that the order should, quote, "involve more than just a simple and archaeological reconstitution of the ancient ministry of the deaconesses. It is a question of revitalization. In other words, of its realization in the context of the culture and in the requirements for the present day," unquote. Around this time, the Antiochian Archdiocese of North America also entertained the possibility of reviving this order. In 1987, Metropolitan Philip Saliba of blessed memory had accepted, en masse, members of what were known as, quote-unquote, the Evangelical Orthodox Church. This was a group founded by the former members of the Campus Crusade for Christ, who had been looking for the ancient church. As in the early church, they had ordained men to the episcopacy, as well as women to the diaconate. However, when they were received into canonical orthodoxy, their bishops were received as priests, they were ordained as priests, and their female deacons were laicized. Although there was hope that the former deaconesses would be ordained into canonical orthodoxy in the future, then Patriarch Ignatios IV was not in favor of such a move, and the initiative died. The possibility of the revival of the female diaconate began to attract interest again in the lead up to the Great and Holy Council that was eventually held in Crete in 2016. In November of 2014, an international pan-Orthodox Christian fellowship of women theologians and other lay servant leaders called the St. Catherine's Vision published a, quote, "call for the rejuvenation of the ministry of the ordained deaconess," unquote. It was addressed to His All Holiness Patriarch Bartholomew I and the Secretariat of the Great and Holy Council. Building upon the consensus of the Rhodes consultation, the 20-page proposal summarized the history of the order, confirmed that deaconesses were actually ordained to higher orders, hierotonia, by highlighting various aspects of the Byzantine ordination rite, emphasized a need for such a ministry, and outlined the possible duties of a future female deacon. The document also pointed to the need of the revival of the entire diaconate in the life of the church. Lastly, it outlined the parameters of a pilot program to begin the process. A major conference was then held in 2015 in Thessaloniki, Greece, entitled Deaconesses, Ordination of Women in Orthodox Theology, sponsored by the Center for Ecumenical, Missiological, and Environmental Studies, or CEMIS. It further explored the question specifically of reviving the female diaconate rather thoroughly from biblical, liturgical, patristic, systematic, canonical, and historical theology. Then in 2016, Patriarch Theodoros of Alexandria actually took steps to revive the female diaconate, consecrating, as we heard last night, not ordaining, but consecrating 5 women, which he called deaconesses, to help meet the ministerial needs of his diocese, something totally within his authority as head of an autocephalous church. In some quarters of the United States, this announcement was met with support and hope. In other quarters, it was met with a bit of confusion. Well, you call them deaconesses, but you really didn't ordain them? What does that mean? And in still other quarters, it was met with vocal opposition. An example of the former. In October 2017, a group of renowned Orthodox liturgists, including Father Alkiviadis Kalivas, who gave his part of the book launch yesterday, and other seminary and theological school professors from the United States and Greece expressed their support for the Patriarch of Alexandria and said, quote, to restore in a timely fashion the order of deaconess within the borders of the Patriarchate, unquote. They emphasized that the reinstitution of the female diaconate does not, quote, constitute an innovation, but the revitalization of a once vibrant, functioning, and effectual ministry, unquote. They also clarified, quote, that the restoration of the female deacon is such that neither doctrinal issues nor authoritative precedents are at stake, unquote. They concluded by applauding the Patriarch of Alexandria for, quote, giving flesh to an idea that has been discussed and studied by pastors and theologians for decades. In 2020, CEMIS held a follow-on symposium entitled Deaconesses Past, Present, and Future, which, by the way, whose proceedings are part of the book. They have now been published in a book form, and they are available at our book table. Once again, this issue was studied from scriptural, historical, ecumenical, and spiritual perspectives. In addition, included a memorandum, or rather a memorial, for Deaconess Phoebe, or rather Deaconess Maria, and a statement of support from the noted Orthodox liturgists. The general conclusion and recommendation was for the immediate restoration of the deaconess. In an open letter to the churches, the report declared, quote, there is no biblical or theological, canonical or liturgical, patristic or pastoral reason for the contemporary church to delay or to obstruct the full restoration of the historical institution of deaconess, unquote. Furthermore, it emphasized, quote, the urgent need for the revived diaconate, male and female, in response to the growing pastoral demands and missionary challenges facing parishes throughout the world, unquote. So this brings us to today. The St. Phoebe Center continues, as our mission states, to educate and prayerfully advocate for the revival of the ordained female diaconate to help meet the ministerial needs of the Orthodox Church in our world today. We have held numerous conferences, as you see in the packet, as well as webinars and other online fora to help educate the faithful about and build support for this ministry, articulating the need for its revival and emphasizing the ways that it could benefit the life of the church today. And this work continues. In the meantime, we also want to acknowledge and support the work that women are already doing in the church. And for that, I will turn to my esteemed colleagues. Thank you. Just, you want to make an announcement about chairs? There's some chairs over there. For those of you who are standing, there are additional chairs in here on this side.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation, and I'm glad to be here. I'm a bit of a trouble because I'm a professor, teacher. I love to talk, so for me to narrow everything in a few minutes, but I'm going to try my best. Keep me on my toes here, Teva, with time. I'm going to start with two quotes from Matthew that really represent the work that I've been doing, that I'm sharing, the perspective I'm sharing. One is from Matthew 23:26. Oh, blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean. And the second one is from Matthew 15:17. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, and slander. So my work and my perspective is from working through the heart, through the thoughts, through the emotions, inner experience of people in order to clean their inner cup. And I'm going to talk about the needs that I see in my work, also the unique gifts that women bring that could potentially so benefit the church. And also we talked yesterday about change from top down and grassroots. I'm a kind of grassroots person, so with my husband Sebastian, we co-founded Team for the Soul, so I'll share a bit about the vision and what we're doing there. So in terms of the needs and what I'm hearing from people, I mean, there's a lot of cultural pressure right now. There are a lot of changes that are happening. There's a collapse of local communities. Now we have social media with all sorts of ecosystems, and people don't communicate necessarily directly or even get their information properly. Now we're dealing with artificial intelligence. Our kids are sucked in social media, and there's confusion about body, about gender, who am I? I mean, there's a lot of conversations that are swimming in our culture, so to speak, and our people we are hearing all this, and somehow we need to metabolize this, but there's confusion, there's family dynamics, people are hurt, kids are changing genders, faithful parents are really hurt, and they don't know where else to go, who do they talk with, and all this is reflecting also in their inner world. So I'm going to share a bit of the needs that I see in the inner confusion. People are under a lot of stress. There's a pressure now. Everything is moving very fast. And we, especially as Christian, we are really in trouble because we love to give like Christ, but there's always need. The needs are endless. So if we don't learn how to regenerate, how to really take care of ourselves in a healthy way without indulging, we're at a high risk of burnout. And I'm talking about, I've seen it in clergy, I've seen it in laity. It's everywhere. I burn out twice, as if one time was not enough, but I've learned my lesson. I've seen, because it doesn't come with bells and whistles. By the time we realize there's burnout, it's too late. There's confusion about how our thoughts are working, what are the inner laws of thoughts, how they work with how our emotions are working, that they have different laws, and they clash sometimes. We don't know how to navigate our inner landscape, how to activate our will necessarily. I mean, we talk about it, but we are not taught how to do this, and how to do this in ways that are actually working. We talk about to put our care to the sides in our prayers. Well, how do we do that? Just me saying, okay, I'm not going to think about this, is not necessarily working. Thoughts are swirling in our mind. We're trying to be silent. We want to descend our thoughts into our heart. And then what? We want to be silent for a few minutes, and then thoughts are popping up, emotions are coming up. So it gets confusing for people. And then what's happening, especially I've seen this in men, but especially in women, they start dealing with self-doubt. The self-critic comes in. Maybe I'm not faithful enough. What do I know? So it's crumbling down the inner sense of self, and there is a need for inner integration and alignment. I would say just very simple: body, mind, heart, and soul, emotions, thoughts, our body sensations and realities, and our soul, our spirit, and also a need of alignment. And also a change to to higher consciousness, because there's a lot of subconscious processes that are driven by our past conditions, by cultural patterns. So we need to bring this to awareness in a way and metabolize them. So with that, things like, I'm just going to tap on just very little, things like regret, repression, suppression. Then we repress our emotions. We're trying to be so good and try to do everything, but then our emotions and our needs, when we don't take care of them, they will come up in ways that are unexpected. We're projecting onto others. And then we come into interactions. We fight when actually the conversation is not the part of the conversation. There's a saying in mental health, what seems on the surface is not actually about the surface. It's actually much deeper needs that are not met and conversations that are actually not happening. So with that, another need that I see a great need for education. Most of us, obviously I'm in this field, so I'm very aware, but without it, we don't know some of the social phenomena that are happening in terms of the psychology of it. Things like, we talk about obedience, but there's actually obedience as an extreme got us as humanity into trouble. Think of communism, think of Nazi. There were actually kind people that followed orders because they were trained in the obedience. So obedience is great, but we need to qualify that. How about and there's research around that, psychological research. There's research on conformity and groupthink, de-individuation, group polarization, mere exposure phenomenon. I'm not expecting, and I'm not going to go in explaining them. I'm just touching here. There's phenomena that are happening even at the group level that we take it for granted as just me as an individual, or we try to spiritualize them to deal with them, but they're actually known psychological phenomenology that if we would know about it, the conversation will turn differently. We have also great risk. I think women are a great risk, and I'm going to touch on some of their needs. They are more prone to follow obedience. They're more prone to stay silent because they're trying to preserve many times their families. And they're also, let's say in a family, there's an abusive husband. The wife will try to preserve their children and their peace in their family, which means they're going to be silent and they're going to internalize the anger, and with that, women in general are at high risk of emotional, spiritual abuse, physical, sexual abuse, and they're not going to talk about it. No one puts that on Facebook. They have a hard time expressing that to people in general because they think it's their fault. So they did something. This is all happening many times subconsciously, so they don't talk easily about these things, but I see them, they're caught into this. And there's a term for this, codependency, when the dynamics are happening where one party is silent and they're accepting abuse for whatever reason subconsciously, and the other is feeling justified to continue. I see this in many, many levels. So those are some of the great needs that I see. And on the other hand, I see unique gifts that women have, unique incarnational gifts. And as I taught psychology, I've been fascinated and picking up research that's been done showing that there is a difference in gender in terms of how we perceive emotions, our coping skills, and how we interact. So I'm just going to touch on just very briefly on a few of them. But women have been shown to have a great, what's called emotional literacy. They have, in studies, they show they have a nonverbal sensitivity to others and an ability to decode other people's emotions. And they also have more language. And again, this is no judgment. This is how God created us. But in general, in their studies, they show that men might use just one word for an emotion versus women have this, I love this term, emotional literacy, and they go in on depth. So having women to women ministry is going to greatly help because women will feel heard. And also, we should talk about also ministry women to children, because we are training our children. The next generation is training the family. And many times our women are drawn to connecting, and they'll be able to teach emotional intelligence to our our children in very organic ways. And also, women in general, psychological research is showing they need to they respond better to, there's different coping skills. They respond better to the relational type of coping skills. So they will reach out. They will reach out and they will support and help. This is more common in women versus men in general respond better to with problem-solving coping skills. And they're both needed. But there's just different aspects, like Dr. Carrie Frost was saying. Those are in her book. We need all these gifts in the church. It's not like one is better than the other. We just need to be mindful of this. And very interesting research that I came across when I was teaching. It was like mind-blowing. Both men and women in general are more interested to be listened by women. They love talking with women, and research is showing why. So women deaconess can minister in these ways if it's linked, and I think we have enough discussion here about the theology and the history of it, but when it's linked to our church, it can benefit the church. Right now, what I see is that when there is a need, emotional, thought need, any problems, we delegate them to the mental health professionals. I'm one of them. God bless them. They're amazing, right? But we need to, how do we do this also within the church? And it's hard with license because of the confidentiality reasons. It's hard to have necessarily mental health treating parishioners. That's a boundary. There's issues with that, although it can be done in a safe way. I'm not saying that, but there's some other avenues. Like life coaching is a new profession coming up, new, 30, 40 years. It can help. It brings people from where they are to fulfilling their potential. So now back to I've talked about some of the needs that I've seen. I've talked also about some of the unique gifts that women have. I'm going to talk about a bit of our work at Team for the Soul. We co-founded this in our coaching and spiritual care practice in 2019. I've been doing this since 2016, but we actually created our organization. And in time, it really evolved, especially because of COVID and the need that I've seen with people with a burnout. So I've developed in the last several years a curriculum that we have. It's going to be 2 years. Right now I'm 2/3 way, almost done. Asynchronous learning with ways to really help people to stabilize their inner forces, thoughts, emotions, body sensation, and our spirit or soul in a way that can be done in a synchronous learning, right, in an educational platform. But there are ways actually to do this. And I've been blessed to work with several students in this process to see how successful it is. And the whole idea is we can regenerate 4 times a day, have our prayer rule 4 times a day, and integrate body, mind, heart, and soul in such a way that we can deal and really regenerate on a daily basis. We don't have to wait until weekend or vacation. We can do this, and our church is showing through our prayer life that we can do this every day. And in the same time, how to work with our environment. There are studies showing we can set up our environment in ways to sustain our ritual. We have a fast brain and a slow brain, and the slow brain picks up triggers from the environment. We can train that to put it to good use. How to understand thoughts, emotion. We talk about watchfulness. That's linked to focus, right? How do we train our focus in such a way that we can actually do what we talk in our church, watchfulness, and be mindful and tap into awareness. This is actually the psychological term that many times we use to really reflect that space in between between emotions and thoughts. That actually is that silence, that the luminous darkness that we talk in our faith. So there's so much parallel and synchronicity that we can bring to our church. training our will, understanding God's nature and how we interact with that, healthy boundaries, different with different. All this is in the curriculum, right? That I'm developing, and now, as I said, I'm 2/3. And I use the same curriculum as either asynchronous learning, or I have a community of Christian women that are serving, and also I do one-to-one life coaching. Now, this to me, and I'm going to wrap up with this, is a work that I see needed, and I'm just doing it because people are constantly saying, yes, this is so important, and I see the benefits. But the vision is, I'm only one person, where this will be needed to actually train practitioners, train others they could do and use this curriculum. And I've done several pilots. I've used actually here at Holy Cross, I was blessed to do a seminar, Faith and Character, where I used some of the kernels of this curriculum with amazing results for the first-year seminarians. I've also used this curriculum with a nonprofit organization as a pilot, and right now I'm in conversation with a Christian school to train their faculty. We're doing a pilot because they're burning out. And I love this quote from Richard Rohr: transformed people transform people. And of course, Saint Seraphim of Sara, acquire spirit of peace, and thousands of you will be saved. So that kind of incarnational way. So that's where we're going with this, and I can see that our clergy needs all this knowledge, and I'm not the only one. So this is just one example, what I'm doing, but there's a lot of things that are happening. I mean, I was blessed to hear about the Assembly of Bishop initiative, and they have the peace of mind. They're training people to intervene in small steps. But my thinking is, why wait? Prevention is better than treatment, as they say in medicine. So let's continue this work, and may all this work and your work, I'm sure many of you are doing similar work, so may you be blessed. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by can everybody hear me? I'm very tall, so I'm like, okay. I'd like to begin by thanking the St. Phoebe Center and Dr. Frederick Frost for including me in this weekend of fellowship and edification and what I feel like is real progress and real revolution. I'm very excited. I've been looking forward to this for months. And I'd like to thank my fellow panelists. I'm so honored and humbled to be in your ranks. So thank you for including me, and to our moderator who's leading our discussion today. I'm a big fan of the old adage for writers, write what you know. And I'm gonna try and apply that today to my remarks and speak what I know. I don't have a theological background. I studied political science and human rights, and I work in management consulting. So I'm going to tell you about my experience as being tonsured, a reader and a chanter in the Greek Orthodox Church, and how those experiences to me have illuminated several things which I think are roadblocks and challenges to the inclusion of women in our church, not just obstacles to the reinstitution of the deaconess, but broader issues which permeate our collective environment. So to give you all some background, I grew up very musical. I'm a trained classical vocalist. I went to conservatory in high school. But I felt called when I was in high school, near the end of my high school career, to learn Byzantine chant. I had always been intrigued on a sensory level hearing chant in the church, and it had seemed kind of foreign to me and kind of closed off and vague and shadowy, despite hearing it sometimes on Sundays. And it seemed like something quite far off and mystical, like some of the other things in our church which are kind of mysteries. And so I felt called to take time and learn and study Byzantine chant. I, as a senior in college, was accepted to Trinity College, or as a senior in high school, was accepted to Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. I decided to defer for a year, defer my acceptance, and come here to the theological school and study Byzantine chant. And so that's where my journey towards becoming a tonsured reader and a chanter really took off. I had grown up in my church reading, but I had never really felt all that welcome to go up to the chant stand and the reading stand and experiment in the way that I saw young men and adolescent boys being invited to do so. And so being here, I felt like everything was really launched in terms of my journey of learning chanting and learning the sort of art of oration up at the chant stand. I here trained under Father Romanos Karanos. He was my chant professor. He was somebody who brought women into the experience of chanting and was completely inclusive. And that for me gave me such a strong foundation and example of how things should be. And through him, I was fortunate, and through the groups here, I was fortunate to be included and brought into these ranks and learn how to chant, learn how to read comfortably. And I was tonsured by His Eminence Metropolitan Methodius of Boston in 2017. My experience being tonsured, the lead up to it, the follow-up, I don't want to say the aftermath, but the follow-up, I think is a microcosm and a reflection of some of the problems, the challenges which we do face. I learned the night I was being tonsured in a service where I was being tonsured, a reader and a chanter, and altar boys in my home parish were being tonsured readers and chanters, that my then parish priest had been very against my being tonsured, and he wanted to keep it specifically limited to exclusive to altar boys who were going to be tonsured. But His Eminence Metropolitan Methodius, in what I feel is a real act of courage and daring, said, no, there's no reason why this young woman should not be included in these ranks. She's training, so this is the way to include people and get people to stay in the church. And so I was tonsured. It was a wonderful, wonderful blessing, which is kind of indescribable in retrospect. And in the days following, I was really kind of I felt that I was on cloud nine. But there were moments where that reverie of bliss would be interrupted when, for example, I found out that people whom I had considered friends, other young men whom I had considered friends, were behind my back laughing and deriding the fact that I, a young woman, had been tonsured. And they had been saying, the women should stick to the pews, stick to that. So that for me was very illustrative. And I share that not as a criticism of those individuals, but as something which I think shows us the mindset which we face in our church. And this is certainly not something which is everywhere and in every individual, and it's not a condemnation of men. I'm not here to say women versus men by any means. This is something which permeates all of our minds as women and men. And so I've given you a bit of my background there so that you can see the context through which I'm approaching this today. But I want to identify three kind of challenges which I've observed since being tonsured, which have really come to light since being tonsured for me, which I think our church faces and which I think in fora such as these we can begin to address. The first thing is weaknesses and gaps in our church education. I'll address that. The second thing that I want to talk about, and I'm definitely ambivalent to use this language because we have an expert here on this, but our group psychology and our collective emotional blocks which we have in our community to including women. And the third thing is the very kind of basic functional institutional blocks which we have to including women. Speaking to the first challenge, the issue of a lack of education and sometimes problematic education and misinformation, we'll obviously be getting to this in the myth-busting panel up next, and so I'm not going to belabor the point and leave that to the experts. But I've found that both in my generation, I'm 25, and in older generations, and even now looking at younger generations, there is such a dearth of information available that it's not systematically shared in our parishes, whether we're Antiochian or Greek or Carpatho-Russian, about women's role in the church. Historically, but also contemporaneously. I feel as a Greek Orthodox Christian, I always, growing up, would hear, oh, the women of the Philoptochos, which, amazing. We need women of the Philoptochos, and their service is so valuable and meaningful. But I've found that in terms of the way that most often clerics approach women's participation and presence in the church, it's been limited to those kinds of more, those limited aspects of participation, which do not enter the liturgical space and are much more, I would say, extracurricular in nature. And so I feel that as a community, we simply don't know what role women have to play in the church and have played in the church. And I think that we need, as a community, to create, and we have bases of knowledge, but we need to work on disseminating these knowledge bases. And also, we need to be courageous in sharing information, which may make people uncomfortable. His Eminence Metropolitan Nathaniel, last night, you began, Your Eminence, by saying how you were nervous and how we have to confront the things that make us uncomfortable in discussions. And a lot of this information can be very uncomfortable, I think. Some people whom I've spoken to are shocked that there was a female diaconate in the history of our church. And that's the reality. But we have to have these uncomfortable conversations and be vulnerable with one another. And I think that that's at the crux of the knowledge issue in our church, is being willing to confront these things. The second issue, looking at the group psychology, and again, I don't want to use language about which I'm not an expert, but I do find that there's always kind of a discomfort when we talk about women in the church. There may not be an immediate antagonism, but people tense up. The room tenses up oftentimes, I've noticed, when we're having discussions about women in the church. And I think that we intergenerationally and across our different social circles have transmitted these really kind of negative associations and connotations about what it means to be a woman in the church and in the created order. I've seen, just in terms of interpersonal relationships in the church and on the chant stand, that there is a general tone towards women, which for men, often there's a proclivity to view women with suspicion at best and antipathy at worst. And amongst women as well, we're guilty as well of falling into these psychological traps which we've laid for ourselves over generations. We doubt ourselves. And I think that we really need to work to address these things and unpack, as people say, these psychological hindrances that we have in our community. And these are very difficult discussions. A lot of us have suffered spiritual trauma and emotional trauma by things we've experienced in the church, or maybe we've inflicted it upon other people. And I think we need to really be willing to look at ourselves in the mirror and look at each other and remember that we're all made in the image and likeness of God, and see we need to treat each other equally. We need to be open to one another's views and see that this issue of including women in the church and restoring the female diaconate is not just an institutional issue. It's not an issue of power or administration. It's a much more fundamental issue of how we view one another vis-a-vis the created order and vis-a-vis our relationship with God and Christ, and seeing ourselves as equal. So I think that we really need to begin by addressing these psychological blocks that we have in our community and beginning to understand how these have developed, what we can do in our communities, whether at the macro level or the micro level, how we can address them. And the third obstacle, and this kind of is an umbrella of everything, but is the institutionalized exclusion of women in the church. And I'm curious, I'm gonna do like a little survey here. How many people in this room have, at their home parishes or at the parish they attend, have a woman routinely on the chant stand or the reading stand? Okay, so that's a pretty good number. So I think that with that, we see that women are in these institutional spaces. And I've been, in past months, going to y'all conferences, going to other events with other young Orthodox Christians. I've been pleasantly surprised to find that so many people feel that there is a very strong presence of women in the liturgical space in their churches. And yet, women are often excluded from the decision-making space in our institutions. So there's this very weird paradox at play. And I think we need to examine why that is, why it's increasingly, which on one level is a very positive development, acceptable for women to be outwardly participatory in the church, in the liturgical space in particular, but not to have any decision-making power in the future of our institutions, and power in what role we ourselves as women play in the church. And I think that I'm going to keep it brief because I know we have question and answers coming up. But I think that this weekend is a really, really meaningful and wonderful way for us to begin having these conversations and go out to our communities and be courageous and continue these discussions. It's definitely very intimidating at times to have these conversations and be vulnerable about our experiences. But I think that if we remember that these issues are not just about women, they're about the future of our church and about the survival of our church, then that can be inspiration enough for all of us to try and make a real difference at whatever level we can, whether that be bringing a young girl and a young boy up to the chant stand and having them coexist and collaborate harmoniously on the chant stand, or whether that be speaking to our clerics and having very candid, respectful but candid conversations with them about what we need and what we'd like to see and how we can all collaborate across institutional levels to make positive change. So I'm very excited to be here, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. It was wonderful to hear all of your remarks. And before we go to our question and answer portion of this session, I'm going to read the St. Phoebe Center's respectful discussion statement. The St. Phoebe Center seeks to promote respectful and reasonable discussion about once again ordaining women to the diaconate in the Orthodox Church and women's ministry in the church. We expect that all participants, both panelists and attendees, will treat each other with the highest regard, acknowledging that we are all children of God and will engage with the topic at hand and refrain from personal criticism. We ask that if a specific example of an incident in the life of the church is offered, that any identifying remarks of people involved, or if a personal story of any others involved, be withheld so that we may discuss these issues generally and with respect for privacy. Participants who engage in personal attacks or otherwise denigrate the conversation will not be welcome at our events. Finally, we encourage your curious, robust, and respectful engagement with the work of the St. Phoebe Center. Thank you. Yes. First, I'm going to ask if any of our panelists have questions for each other and would like to respond to anything that another panelist said. And then afterward, we'll open the discussion to everyone.
Okay. I do have a question for my esteemed panelists here. Each of you are working in various aspects of ministry in the church as a chanter and as a I would say life coach, as pastoral care minister.
Spiritual care life coach.
Okay, very good. What I would like to ask is, how has your experience of what you do, how can we add value to that by being more connected into the ecclesial life? So for instance, as a life coach, you do wonderful things in an environment that is not necessarily connected to our church life. How could, for instance, either it's the ordained female diaconate and or some type of formal tonsuring for your ministry, how is that connected, or how can it connect to our life in the church, and then thereby actually building up the church more so?
Thank you for asking. Can you hear me? Is this my good? My experience is that, which I mentioned, there is a bit a disconnect between my work and how I could potentially help the church. Now,
Can't hear in the back.
how about now? So I see there's a disconnect. In other words, and I'm talking for many people who are doing this kind of work, if it's synchronized with the church, if it has, make sure the teachings are aligned, there's synchronicity of the message, how much more impact it could have for building our church. Right now there is disconnect, and even when I did counseling here at Holy Cross, right, as a counselor, we do spiritual formation and also psychological formation, of course, but it's disconnected from what someone might hear in the actual local church. And then many times there's that disconnect bring tension internally. Well, I heard this person saying this, my priest or spiritual father say this, and you're saying this, how do I integrate that? A lot of my work has been to just unpack. Imagine this work done in synchronicity with our clergy in the local church, so there is already an shared vision and understanding. In other words, whatever the priest and the clergy is, the message they are sharing, it's synchronized with the kind of work we are doing in the parishioners, because we're all hearing the same message in church every week. Can you imagine how more powerful we'll be? I think the difference is in this lack of synchronicity, this lack of alignment. So I see the misalignment internally, and there's a misalignment in the church. Not anyone's fault. It's just by the nature how now in our 20th and 21st century, for any psychological need, we refer outside. Is not integrated, and we're blessed with sometimes many priests and clergy that do have psychological training, but many they don't. I mean, why would we expect them to have 2 degrees? I mean, that's a lot to ask for our priests, right? But there's ways that this can be done in community and within the local parish.
Can everybody hear me? No? Okay. My goodness. Can everybody hear me now? Okay. Yes, speaking to your point, Dr. Popa, about synchronicity, I agree. I think there is a lack of synchronicity in terms of our kind of institutional activities in the church and how these seep into our life outside of the church as well and impact our ministry and Christ's work. I think that speaking to chanting and reading, I feel that in a way it's a bit more limited in terms of the mode of expression than your work, because we are having to recite something which is already written, and that's our job for the service. However, the act of being present and showing that there is diversity in our work and in our ministry is something very meaningful in and of itself. And so speaking to this issue of synchronicity and of having sort of more correspondence across various levels and across various church spaces, I think that across parishes, for parishes maybe who have made more progress than others on integrating women into the church, speaking to that part of it, it's useful to have dialogue. Father Chrysavgis last night mentioned the importance of continuing dialogue, and I think that so much of our work that we're doing is kind of, at this point, still trial and error. and learning what works for a particular community may not work for another community or another parish. And so I think that keeping an open line of communication with the ministry that we're doing will make it that much more impactful, because we can kind of troubleshoot across our various communities, and rather than existing in very static, isolated bubbles, we can share what works, what doesn't work, who can be brought in, and how we can double and triple our impact.
If I could add one more comment. In systems thinking and looking at organizations, there is power and love when we come together. And I want to give a medical metaphor. One cell can do us so much in a body, but a tissue that is as the conglomerate of all the cells are organized can do so much more. So to your point, Teva, that I heard one of your talks that really stuck with me is that when women are ordained and we have deacon and deaconesses in the functions that can help the church, it will actually, it's the blood of the organization, the power and the love. The circle is, the flow is present in such a way that is synchronicity, because at its best, that's the institutions are very helpful when they're working really well. And I think one of the geniuses of our Orthodox Church is that we don't have the fundamental hierarchical from just one person leading the entire Orthodox Church. We have local churches, we have our local bishops, we have different jurisdiction. That is actually very healthy, because the more a system grows, it's harder to actually sustain the good system and the right flow of energy and the cycle of and circle of power and love that can be so beneficial.